Hey everyone, Delve here. You can check out my channels here. Today I'm excited to cover the Dexterity stat in Dark Souls 3. On the main, I think Dexterity is weaker than Strength, but it still has some extremely good and interesting weapons available to it. The first upside, and the most important one, is that Dexterity has great access to lots of fast and interesting weapons. Being fast is really good in this game, as you'll be much more likely to hit enemies first and stagger them, or get extra attacks in against bosses here or there. The weapon types associated with Dexterity are also pretty unique and interesting. Things like the sais, daggers, and curved swords usually swing quite fast and sometimes have other interesting properties associated with them. In a few cases, these unique fast weapons can actually be quite powerful, and these standout weapons are the main benefit to using Dexterity. Dexterity also has the easiest access to bows and arrows, as well as some of the better bows in the game, which is occasionally useful. The next upside is slash damage, which is the damage type that is primarily associated with Dexterity in this game. In other Souls games, slash is usually the worst damage type, since armored enemies tend to resist it. But in Dark Souls 3, this isn't actually that much of a problem, and some enemies are decently weak to it. Many Dexterity weapons naturally come with bleed damage as well, so that's a nice bonus that sometimes is relevant. The last main benefit is the Sharpen Fusion. This can be used to give most weapons dex scaling, and this can be quite useful on some weapons which may surprise you, such as clubs and maces even. Tragically, some of your best options here are weapons that I've already covered in the Strength Guide. Weapons like the Reinforced Club and the War Pick are actually better than weapons like spears and katanas, at least when sharpen fused. But of course, this does also broaden your options considerably, which includes plenty of weapon types such as straight swords, great swords, and halberds. Onto the downsides, and Dexterity has quite a few. Despite the fact you have a good number of compelling options, many of your options are also quite poor as well. A lot of the interesting weapon types associated with Dexterity struggle to be useful. Weapon types like spears, thrusting swords, and whips are all okay, but not especially compelling either. Usually these weapons are weak when compared to other weapons because they deal low poise damage, low damage, and they don't even attack that fast. This means that your best option for thrust damage is a sharpen fused weapon of some other class, such as a longsword or halberd or a war pick like I already mentioned. Dexterity weapons also tend to deal less poise damage, which makes sense of course. A massive great hammer is probably going to stagger better than a katana or a scythe. That's not that weird. Unfortunately, staggering enemies is one of the best uses for the slower weapons in general, so if you're using a slow weapon and it's not staggering, that's a noticeable downside. With that being said, you do still have some respectable large options that can guard, break, and stagger, at least when sharpen fused. And those are the only real downsides. On the main, I would say that you have lots of bad options, but also a handful of extremely good options as well. Okay, we'll start with the starting class. I recommend Mercenary. You could also go with Thief or Assassin, but Mercenary starts with 16 Dexterity, and it also comes with an extremely powerful weapon. The Sellsword's Twin Blades are a titanically powerful weapon and can be easily used throughout the entire game. They do extremely high damage, attack really quickly, especially for a twin weapon, that's pretty rare, and even do a surprising amount of stagger damage as well. You can synergize them with items like Pontiff's Right Eye, but their damage is so extreme that it's not even necessary. This is probably the best weapon I'm going to recommend in this guide, if not the best weapon in the entire game. When you reach Firelink Shrine, you have a couple interesting choices. The first is the dagger, which can be bought from the Shrine Handmaid. This weapon can't do more damage than Sellsword's Twin Blades, but it does attack faster than anything else, which makes it probably the second strongest dex weapon in the game overall. The short range makes it hard to use against some bosses, and it's weak against enemies with shields, so if you want to use it, you'll probably have to get good at either kicking or backstabbing. In spite of all of this, it's an absurdly good option because you are very likely to stun lock enemies to death, and it's also extremely stamina efficient. A simple and unassuming weapon, but also one of your best options. Next up is the halberd, which can also be bought from the Shrine Handmaid. This is probably the best spear in the game, despite being a halberd. If you want a thrust weapon, this is the weapon I recommend, other than a war pick, or you could also go with like a claymore or something like that. Just stay away from thrusting swords and spears in my opinion. It does have a strength requirement of 15, and you will want to sharpen fuse it, but it does decent damage, has good range, and is pretty good at guard breaking enemies, and it even has wide sweeping attacks as well, so that's kind of nice. Last up is the Uchikatana, which can be obtained by killing the Swordmaster outside of Firelink Shrine. This is a fairly unimpressive weapon, but it's not terrible or anything like that. It comes with bleed and sort of a charging attack, as well as a thrust attack on the one-handed R2. It also has decent range, and it does okay poise damage, so you do get nice perks and flexibility, but I'd say it's worse than any of the weapons that I've covered so far. It attacks kind of slow for a dex weapon, and it also consumes a lot of stamina per swing. Throughout the game, katanas across the board play out as bad versions of the reinforced club, in my opinion, but they aren't unusable. I feel sort of compelled to cover katanas because, people are curious about them, and they're pretty bad, but they're not useless. The next weapon is the longbow, which can be located in the high wall of Lothric, near the first Puss of Man. This is an extremely good bow that can last you the entire rest of the game, so I do recommend picking this up. It can be used to snipe the nearby dragon for a free large Titanite shard, but you'll need a lot of arrows to do that. Okay, next up is the Great Scythe. This can be found in the Undead Settlement on the way to the boss. The damage on this weapon isn't ridiculous, but it does attack fairly quickly, has wide sweeping attacks, and it obviously has quite a long range. It doesn't do that much poise damage, but its attacks also pierce through shields, making it an extremely good option against run-of-the-mill enemies. The special attack can sometimes do really good damage too, and it also even comes with some bleed on it, which is great every once in a while. Highly recommend this weapon, and I think it's one of your best options. Once you've killed Curse-Rotted Greatwood, you'll unlock boss weapons, and to be honest, I don't think Dexterity has amazing boss weapon options. One of the better ones is the Hollow Slayer Greatsword, which can be obtained by trading in the Curse-Rotted Greatwood Soul. This weapon is barely a dex weapon and has a strength requirement of 14, but it also is an extremely good greatsword with a diverse moveset that can also guard break with the special attack. It also has the unique property of dealing 20% bonus damage to hollow enemies, which actually includes a lot of enemies, including enemies like Winged Knights, Cathedral Knights, Silver Knights, and even the Deacons of the Deep. Very strong option for a bigger, slower weapon. Next up is the Astoria Greatsword. This can be found in the graveyard area at the entrance to the Cathedral of the Deep. This weapon has a lot going for it and tends to have good scaling when infused, including the Sharp Infusion. It has a strength requirement of 16, but is also very light and has a good range with the R2. A highly useful weapon and probably your best option for a big weapon in the entire game. Once you get to Farron Keep, you can find the Black Bow of Ferris, which drops from one of the 3 giant goat enemies clumped together if you go left from the start. Fires faster than the longbow and is probably the best bow in the game, but also not really that different either. Okay, there's only 2 more weapons I'm going to talk about. The first one is the Chaos Blade, which can be found in the alternate version of Firelink Shrine after Champion Gundyr. This is probably the best version of the Chaos Blade in the entire series, as it only drains 1% HP per attack, and it has decent damage. The best thing about this weapon is that it upgrades with Twinkling Titanite, and that you don't have to Sharp Infuse it either, which is nice. Not your best option, but also not bad either. Okay, and the last weapon I'm going to go over is Frida's Great Scythe, which can be obtained by trading in the soul of Sister Frida. This makes it fairly difficult to get, but it also is a solid weapon and mostly an upgrade to the Great Scythe. It's much heavier, and it seems to have a slightly slower attack animation, but it deals good damage and also comes with frostbite damage. A little too late in the game for my taste, but you could also theoretically get this really early as well. Note that it has an intelligence requirement of 12 and a faith requirement of 11. Okay, and onto your character build. I would make sure you have the strength to make use of whatever weapons you want, which is probably in the 14 to 16 range. As usual, getting to 40 dexterity isn't a bad idea at all, and I recommend hitting 60 in the long term. You'll of course want to make sure you put some points here and there into HP, stamina, and equip load as you see fit. For rings, more or less the same as strength. Estus Ring, Covetous Gold and Silver Rings, Chloranthy Ring, and Ring of Steel Protection are all invaluable. If you want an offensive ring, Dexterity is probably the best stat in the game to make use of Pontiff's Right Eye, so not a bad option. Okay, and that's the Dexterity Guide. Not as easy to use as Strength in my opinion, but also has access to a small number of extremely strong weapons, notably Sellsword's Twin Blades, Dagger, and the Great Scythe. I find these weapons to be quite fun to use, honestly even more fun than any of the strength weapons, so Dexterity has that going for it. Thanks for watching.